Okay, well, I think we will get going from here. So first of all, thank you everyone for joining. Good evening. My name is Bertie Lyhne-Gold, the president of the China Future Society, and I want to start by thanking everyone for tuning in to our virtual event this evening. The China Future Society is very excited to welcome you to our third roundtable discussion in our 2020-2021 roundtable series entitled Economic Might, Political Coercion, and the Great Decoupling, China's relationship with trade in the 21st century. The University of Edinburgh's China Future Society is one of the UK's only student-led bodies dedicated to promoting an understanding around Chinese current affairs, history, and culture. Our society is an apolitical organisation, and therefore my role as mediator this evening is to ensure the debate is balanced and fair. Trade has defined the China we know today. Since its accession into the World Trade Organization in 2001, the Chinese economy has grown at a rate that is nothing short of a miracle. Even in a world ravaged by COVID-19, China is one of the few economies escaping a recession and is now poised to overtake the United States of America as the world's largest economy by 2028, 5 years earlier than previously predicted. While trade has defined much of China's growth, we have seen trade cause tensions between China and its partners, coupled with potentially deeper economic ties between Europe and China, causing some dissatisfaction in Washington. Among other issues, President Biden has inherited office from an administration that has placed over $362 billion worth of tariffs on Chinese goods and services, and a marked shift in attitude amongst Washington elites. Of course, this all fits into China's already ambitious plan to spend $1 trillion on building infrastructure in developing countries across the globe. And adjusted for inflation, that is up to 7 times what the United States spent on the Marshall Plan in Europe after the Second World War. Is this simply a plan for more Sino-centric international trade? And what will this look like in the future? Well, here to discuss with me this evening are 2 exceptionally erudite speakers. First, I'd like to introduce Sir Malcolm Rifkind. An alumnus of Edinburgh University, Sir Malcolm has served as a cabinet member under both Margaret Thatcher and John Major. Sir Malcolm served as Secretary of State for Scotland, Transport and Defence, and later as Foreign Secretary, finalising negotiations with China over the transfer of Hong Kong from Britain. Sir Malcolm has had the longest uninterrupted ministerial service in the United Kingdom since Lord Palmerston in the 19th century. Next, I'd like to introduce Bonnie Glaser, a senior advisor for Asia and the director of the China Power Project at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies. Ms. Glaser has worked for more than 3 decades at the intersection of Asia-Pacific geopolitics and US policy. Prior to joining the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, she served as a consultant for various US government offices, including the Department for Defense and State. Ms. Glaser is currently a board member of the US Committee of the Council for Security Cooperation in Asia Pacific, and a member of both the Council of Foreign Relations and the International Institute for Strategic Studies. The format of the debate this evening will be as follows. Each speaker will be given 5 to 10 minutes to pitch their thoughts on our debate topic of China's relationship with trade in the 21st century. And then we will move on to a question and answer session mediated by myself. Now, at this stage, may I invite the audience to post questions throughout speeches and indeed in questions in the chat box on Zoom. Now, you should find that on the bottom of your screen. These will be directed towards, and it should be called the China Future Society. We will be selecting a range of questions in which to pose to our panel during our question and answer session. Now, it's my absolute pleasure to hand over to Sir Malcolm Rifkind for his opening comments on our debate topic this evening, China's relationship with trade in the 21st century. Sir Malcolm.
Well, thank you very, very much indeed. And I must congratulate China Futures on having organized this event and attracted such a substantial audience. We've got each of us up to 10 minutes to put the whole subject in context. And let me make this point to start off with, if I may. Of course, we're all aware that China has, over the last few years, become an extraordinarily large, powerful economic power. And if you're a large economic power, that means you become a pretty large political power as well. But the first point I want to make is simply this. The China we are seeing today is the China we ought to have seen 50 or 60 years ago. If it had not been for the lunacy of Mao Zedong, the great cultural revolution, and so forth, China would have become one of the world economic superpowers at least a generation, if not half a century ago. Why do I say that? It's not just my theory. Just look at the rest of the Far East, or the rest of Asia. Countries like Japan, countries like South Korea, like Taiwan, all became major economic powers in the 1950s or the 1960s, or latest the 1970s. The reason China didn't was because it had imposed upon it a communist ideology. And the fact that it's now transformed itself wasn't thanks to Xi Jinping. It was thanks to Deng Xiaoping, the leader of China some 30 years ago, who came to the view that China could never catch up with the developed world, not just the West, countries like Japan and South Korea and Taiwan, unless it got rid of communism. So today we have a country run by the Chinese Communist Party, no question about that. The ideology and the rhetoric are communist, but they have what is delightfully being called capitalism with Chinese characteristics. And of course, as is well known, there are more billionaires in the People's Republic of China than there are in the United States. So it's certainly not communism that has prevailed. Linked to that is the fact that, of course, not only could China have been here a long time ago, but this is where Xi Jinping is making a huge false claim. The implication is follow our model, follow our system, and other developing countries in the world could be where we are and catch up to where we are. I mentioned Japan and South Korea and Taiwan. They not only are economically prosperous, some of them probably still more prosperous than China is today, but they've done so without subjecting their citizens to a totalitarian state. They are democracies. They are genuine, as much democracies as is Europe or the United States. Their governments come and go depending on the ballot box. They have the rule of law and human rights. And so China has not produced some new model that should be attractive to the wider world. It has actually adopted half of what the free world does and not the other half. And we should never lose sight of that. Having said that, China, nevertheless, as you'd expect from a country of 1.3 billion people that becomes a capitalist state, is now an economic superpower vying with the United States. That is not because the United States or Western Europe have declined in absolute terms. The decline has been, relatively speaking, not just in relation to China, but in relation to most of Asia and large parts of the rest of the world as well. Because we measure these things from 1945, when the United States had 60% of global GDP, because the rest of the world had just emerged from a world war, which had devastated their economies. So these things have to be put into perspective. Now let me turn to the issue of trade, which is very much part of your title for this evening, and that is concerned. Of course, it would be a mistake, in my view, to somehow refuse trade with China, to say we're not going to have economic relations because of its ghastly record on human rights, because of its terrible aggression towards its own Asian neighbors, quite apart from other countries around the world. And China has, under Xi Jinping, behaved very, very badly in relation to Hong Kong, in relation to the incarceration of millions of Uyghurs in Western China, its aggression in the South China Sea against its own neighbors, its threats against Taiwan, and sadly, many other examples of that. But you know, during the whole of the Cold War, we traded with the Soviet Union. We did not stop economic trade, and that was very important. China, of course, is infinitely more important than either Russia is today or the Soviet Union ever was economically. Russia's main strengths are in its natural resources. China, of course, has a modern industrialized economy and is clearly offering to sell what the rest of the world is interested in buying. But I do have to say, and I'll not speak for more than another minute or so, that there has to be caveats towards the economic and limits towards the economic relationship between the country, the United States, Western Europe, including Britain, and other countries trading with China. Because yes, we helped China get into the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization is about free trade between nations. But China doesn't actually respect free trade. It expects to have, and to a large extent does have, the ability to penetrate the markets of the rest of the world, but without proper reciprocity. And that has to be a major constraint from now on. There has to be an insistence that for any access to British, American, European, or other global markets, China must allow comparable access to its own markets. And that must not just be in theory, but in practice. And of course, it doesn't just apply to trade, it also applies to inward investment. Can we invest in Chinese companies and become substantial shareholders? Very difficult when you have the Chinese Communist Party represented on the board of every Chinese company of any size whatsoever. And it's also about question of takeovers. China has tried to buy, and in some cases succeeded in buying, companies in Britain, America, and Western Europe. How many companies are in China have been permitted to be taken over by investors from America, Britain, or Europe? So that is very important. The final point I want to make is, of course, that it's not just about trade. There has to be limits on free trade, not just in relation to China, in relation to all countries, but China being so big, it has a particular significance. First of all, the issue of national security. You cannot rely on a country with whom you have very difficult political relationships, that is behaving in an aggressive way in so many respects, not just in relation to Britain, but to many other countries, in particular its own neighbors. You cannot allow them to get involved in your national security infrastructure. And hence the controversy over 5G and the extent to which Huawei, as a major Chinese company, should have been permitted to get involved. And it's not just Britain, but most countries increasingly are saying, I'm sorry, no, your companies are not free to do what they wish. Ultimately, by Chinese law, they have to do what the Chinese government tells them. Communist Party is represented on their boards, and therefore we cannot allow in national security. But final point, it's not just national security. And this isn't just in relation to China, but this evening we're discussing China. What we have seen, particularly during the pandemic over the last 12 months, is that countries really need to be, not just Britain, not just the West, but countries need to be, wherever they can, more self-sufficient on what they might require at a time of emergency. We cannot rely on the pharmaceutical industry, on medicines, on rare earths, which are minerals used for much of our technological industries. We cannot rely on access to them being dependent on the goodwill of a country on the other side of the world, which particularly if it has a hostile foreign policy and aggressive geopolitical aspirations, may use these economic constraints to prevent us either having medicines or pharmaceuticals or rare earths or other commodities that may be essential to us. So we have to, and most of these things can be done in Britain or America or in Western countries, as long as we start helping with the investment required to do just that. So I conclude by saying that China's with us. It's not going to go away. It can't be ignored, nor should it be ignored. China's a great culture. It's a great country. Sadly, it has a president and a government which has rejected the rule of law as we understand it, has behaved aggressively, much more to its own Asian neighbors than to America or Britain, apart from Hong Kong. And that is sad, but it can prevent trade, but it does impose certain constraints. And we can discuss that further later in this event. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you for such a brilliant speech, Sir Malcolm. Yes, we can continue to discuss that, and I do indeed encourage people to keep sending their questions through on the Q&A. And now I'm going to hand over to Bonnie Glaser for her opening comments on our debate topic this evening. Bonnie.
Thank you. I was not able to unmute myself. Thank you to the China Futures Society for inviting me today, and for all of you for coming to listen this evening. and want to associate myself with Sir Malcolm's comments, all of which I agree with. And I'm going to focus on China's use of trade as a tool in its foreign policy. So China's trade as a percentage of global trade in 1995 was 3%. And in 2018, that increased to 12.4%. So you can see that China's trade has increased dramatically as a percentage of global trade. And this expansion has provided China with a potential source of leverage that it can use and is increasingly using to influence the policies of its trading partners and to advance China's foreign policy goals. China uses its trade with the world both in the form of positive inducements and punitive actions. In the former category, China, of course, provides access to its huge market. So one recent example is at least the pledge in the China-EU Comprehensive Agreement on Investment that European companies have been promised greater market access in some sectors such as private health services and international maritime transport services. But increasingly, and what I'm going to focus on in my talk is about China using trade as a weapon. And it is restricting trade to individual countries, both to punish them for actions or policies that they've taken that have been damaging to Chinese interests, and to deter other countries from following in the footsteps of countries who have harmed Chinese interests. To date, Beijing has used the threat and imposition of trade restrictive measures to punish over a dozen countries for harming Chinese interests. This does not include what I would call broader economic coercion. That would be a much larger set of countries. This is really just in the trade arena. So we can trace this back. The most prominent, I think, initial episode was in 2010, when China blocked salmon imports from Norway. This was after the Nobel Committee awarded the Peace Prize to Chinese human rights activist Liu Xiaobo. And then the same year, Chinese customs officials obstructed exports of rare earths to Japan in an effort to compel Tokyo to release the captain of a Chinese fishing trawler who had been detained after his vessel had collided with a Japanese Coast Guard vessel. And this happened in the disputed waters around the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea. In 2012, there was an incident between China and the Philippines. They had a confrontation at Scarborough Shoal in the South China Sea, and the Philippines discovered that its tropical fruit exports were being quarantined due to what the Chinese claimed was alleged infestation. So there's a long list. It involves Mongolia for hosting the Dalai Lama, South Korea for deploying the THAAD missile defense system, Canada, of course, for its arrest of Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou, and most recently, and a very interesting case is Australia, which has really riled Beijing by many of the actions it has taken. Initially barring Huawei and ZTE from its 5G network, accusing China of interfering in Australia's domestic politics, and I think above all, calling for an independent inquiry into the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic, which I think has been seen as threatening to the Chinese Communist Party. So the number of Australian products that are exported to China and have been subjected to disruption is unprecedented. And they include coal and barley and beef, copper, cotton, sugar, timber, wine, lobster, wheat, wool, and beer. That I have an ongoing list, and it is growing. Now, we have to caveat this, of course, by saying that China is not alone in using trade as a weapon, and the United States has done so on occasion as well. And we can cite as an example the Trump administration's tariffs. This is certainly an example of trade coercion. But I would at least note that the US has been transparent about its actions. We do not deny that this is taking place. And in almost all the cases where China has used trade coercion, it has denied imposing these punitive measures. So when the flow of Chinese tourists to South Korea slowed, and South Korean consumer goods were subjected to boycotts inside China, Chinese officials just forswore any government involvement and instead attributed these actions or the consequences to the strong feelings among the general public in China. Now, in the case, of course, of US tariffs, China was able to file a case against the US in the World Trade Organization, which it has recently won. And the way that China pursues trade coercion makes it very difficult to respond through the WTO. There are some cases that are underway. Australia and Canada have both launched cases. In the rare earths case with Japan, the EU and the United States joined that case. And we did win against China. But many of these cases, because it's difficult to provide evidence of China's coercion, it is more difficult to file a case at the WTO. The Australian case is very interesting to me because the Chinese have actually issued 14 demands. They have a very long list of grievances that really are quite closely connected to what the Prime Minister of Scott Morrison of Australia has correctly said is issues pertaining to Australian sovereignty. And so, of course, they have not been accepted by Australia. But a Chinese official did say that if Australia backed away from its policies on this list, that this would be conducive to a better atmosphere. So this is quite clearly a set of demands. In every instance in which Beijing has restricted imports, the goods affected are products that China can easily obtain from other countries. So China has, for mostly, refrained from blocking imports that are deemed essential to China's economic growth. And in the case of Australia, this includes natural gas and iron ore. Those are not on the list. Not surprisingly, Beijing has put preservation of social stability ahead of penalizing countries for damaging Chinese interests. And in fact, 5 months after curbing the imports of Canadian meat in January 2019, China lifted the restrictions because there was a shortage of pork inside China following the swine fever outbreak. And so prices were rising. And so they eased the restrictions that they had imposed. So then I just want to ask the question, how effective has China's trade bullying been? Well, it's had mixed results. In a few cases, targeted countries have modified their policies after being subjected to these coercive measures. So after 7 years of restrictions on Norwegian salmon exports to China, combined with the political restrictions on interactions between Norwegian and Chinese officials, which I think to Oslo was considered more important, Norway signed a joint statement with Beijing that contained language probably drafted by China that said the Norwegian government reiterates its commitment to a one China policy, fully respects China's sovereignty and territorial integrity, attaches high importance to China's core interests and major concerns, will not support actions that undermine them, and will do its best to avoid any future damage to the bilateral relationship. So I would call that caving in and rolling over. Very few countries, I think, have gone quite that far. But there's also the case with Japan. I think Beijing really won a tactical victory when Tokyo released the Chinese fishing trawler captain without charges. And I also mentioned earlier about the WTO case. In the instance of Mongolia, the government of Mongolia said it would never invite the Dalai Lama again after it was subjected to trade coercion from China, and said it was very sorry that the visit had negatively affected relations between Beijing and Ulaanbaatar. I mean, not surprising, Mongolia, landlocked country, very, very vulnerable to pressure from China. But other countries, including Australia and Canada, have really stood firm in the face of Chinese economic pressure. And the Australian case is ongoing. I would close by saying that evidently China sees value in using these coercive tactics. And even if the targeted country doesn't yield to Chinese pressure, as I said, its actions may deter other countries from pursuing policies that are harmful to China. And the cost to China is negligible, at least so far. In these episodes, the targeted countries have received, at most, rhetorical support from the United States, from some of its like-minded partners, and even that rhetorical support has been quite feeble. I would cite as the most significant response so far to Australia's being targeted with coercion. There's politicians from the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, known as IPAC, represents more than 200 members of parliaments from 19 countries, and they've urged the world to drink Australian wine to offset the losses from China's tariffs on Australian wine sellers, which is up to 212%. So I think there's a pressing need for a coalition of countries to do something about this. Countries that either have already been subjected to coercion or are vulnerable to coercion in the future. So I think some of the actions that could be taken to impose costs include, obviously, joint declaratory statements, WTO challenges where possible, or joining existing ones. And the US and the UK could join Australia's case that it has filed at the WTO. I think we should consider imposing punitive retaliatory tariffs on Chinese exports where possible. And we should also consider ways of providing offsetting assistance to compensate countries and companies for lost revenue due to Chinese coercion. Now, we could never match it dollar for dollar, but it would still demonstrate support among a coalition of countries to help those that are being targeted by China's economic and trade coercion. So it's a bit of a narrower set of issues, I think, than Sir Malcolm talked about, but I thought it might be useful to talk about how China is indeed using its trade to try and influence the agendas and the policies of other countries. And I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Well, a terribly interesting comment. Thank you so much. We've had a lot of questions being coming through from the audience as you both have been speaking. So now we're going to move over to our question and answer. And I'm going to start with by reflecting on the European Union and China. You've both touched on the trade agreement that they've signed, and to provide a bit of context for the audience, that was in December 2020, one of the first trade agreements between the European Union and China. Now, from the Europeans' perspective, it sets down a marker for liberalization and greater trade between the EU and China. But some claim it has caused some disgruntled within Washington. I mean, are economic relationships with Beijing so important that countries and organizations are willing to look past some of the human rights issues and diplomatic concerns that they are present? So Malcolm, what are your thoughts on that? Right,
well, the agreement signed between the European Union and China is a pretty important agreement. And the case for the defense it's not that different to the kind of agreement that the United States and China themselves have in many respects. That's the case for the defense. But the case for the prosecution is also quite significant. First of all, the so-called concessions that the EU say it won from China. I'm not an expert in trade, the details of trade policy, but so far as I'm aware, none of them are bankable. They are assurances rather than rock-solid, enforceable commitments of, for example, equal access for European companies and businessmen to Chinese markets, questions about the protection of technology and so forth. There is no evidence that the Chinese in reality are going to change their behavior. And so far as I'm aware, the agreement does not allow for any enforcement measures if they fail to do so. So I think there may be an accusation of naivety on the part of those negotiating on behalf of the European Union in the agreement that they've signed. The other aspect, which I can't help but mention, was the sadness of the timing of it. We have just had the emergence of a new president of the United States, a development which has been very widely welcomed in most of the world. It is quite clear that the relationship between the United States and China is of supreme global importance. And the United States is not unreasonably, not entitled, but it's not unreasonable that it should expect its fellow democratic nations, particularly the countries of Western Europe, to be as supportive as they can in helping the United States for this particular reason. That we may think that China is a faraway country on the other side of the world. But of course, from a United States point of view, the United States is not just an Atlantic power, it's a Pacific power. China is its neighbor. There is a massive strategic and geopolitical battle which is commencing. I don't mean necessarily a physical battle, let us hope it doesn't come to that, but there is a huge battle about who is going to be the dominant power in the Pacific. It's been the United States. China wishes to replace it. Now, trade and economic relationships are very, very important in that context. And I think it was very sad that the EU chose these first couple of weeks, as it were, of the Biden presidency to appear to put a European coach and horses between Europe and the United States as to how they are choosing to deal with China. The EU doesn't see it that way, or at least say they don't, but I think what happened owes more to Angela Merkel than Europe as a whole. She's coming to the end of her chancellorship, and as we've seen in her relationship with Russia, where they have the very controversial Russian pipeline bringing gas into Central Europe, Merkel is one of those who has most supported this economic measure, putting on one side the geopolitical damage that may be done, well seen in Poland and in the Baltic states, but not accepted in Berlin. So there are parallels there which are slightly disturbing.
I mean, I suppose the European Union might respond in essence saying that there's almost a paradox of instability in that the United States is from under the Trump presidency, is fairly unstable about where its policy direction was going. And there's a somewhat relative stability in essence from at least the Chinese picture. I mean, Bonnie Glaser, what's your thoughts on this? Are the European Union prioritizing trade over human rights issues, diplomatic concerns? And how much should America be concerned?
Well, I agree that the timing of this agreement was unfortunate, and I think there is very little in it that is really going to benefit European companies. I agree that this was essentially something that Chancellor Merkel wanted, and Germany was at the presidency this was something that I think that she had pledged to take across the finish line, and China recognized that this would be a political feather in Angela Merkel's cap. I should also note that the Chinese pressed and brought across the finish line, along with other countries, the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. And the Chinese knew that the United States had come into power a president that would emphasize working with allies. And they are worried about that. So they wanted to show, even before Biden took office, that they could rally the support of other countries and drive wedges between the United States and like-minded countries and groupings of countries. China is willing to use trade for those purposes. I think that there is an element, and has been for a long time, of the EU putting trade, economic and commercial interests as its top priority, and trying to compartmentalize them, to separate them from its larger geopolitical interests. And I think that's a mistake. And I think that it plays into Xi Jinping's hands. I think it was very unfortunate that Angela Merkel was even quoting the words that Xi Jinping used in his recent Davos speech, emphasizing multilateralism. You know, do we really think that Xi Jinping in China is a champion of multilateralism? As somebody who reads Chinese and reads internal speeches, what the Chinese say to themselves, I can tell you that there is a dramatic contrast between what Xi Jinping says in his speeches to the rest of the world at places like Davos, and what he says to the members of the Chinese Communist Party. And so I think it's a bit naive, and it was very, very ill-timed, because I think we should really do our best to try and work together as allies, because we share a commitment to rules-based order, to law, and that includes maritime law, to human rights. We shared values. We want to see democracy strong and vibrant around the world. We don't want to see it undermined. And I would argue that some of China's actions are seeking to undermine democracies, to weaken them around the world. So I think we have a lot to work on. And the Biden administration is so committed to transatlantic coordination and cooperation, and sees it so essential if we are going to be able to manage the rise of China, that it would have been better if we could start out on the right foot together. That said, I don't think that we have lost all of the opportunity. It just means we have more work to do.
Yeah, I suppose you've just touched on it there. I mean, where does this put, in a world of international supply chains, it's not possible for any nation necessarily to go it alone. I mean, where does this put the relationship between the United States and Europe in this presidency for Biden? I mean, if I just sort of go back to Bonnie just for a moment and then we hand over to Sir Malcolm.
We're at the very beginning. And I think that the Biden administration is going to be working with Europe on a number of issues, and supply chain protection is going to be one of them. And it will not be an agenda of decoupling, economic decoupling from China. I think it will be targeted or selective decoupling aimed at, again, what Sir Malcolm was talking about earlier, areas where we should reduce our dependency on China. And for me, that includes 5G. It includes Chinese companies in our 5G networks. It includes medical supplies. And it includes, as he said, rare earths. But it's a list of things that are closely tied to our national security. And I think that these are things we should be working on very closely together.
So Malcolm,
you mentioned supply chains. And it's not just, this is the point I'm about to make, it's not specifically directed against China. It's a broader point, which I think ought to be part of the wider debate, not just in Britain, but throughout the world. It is one thing to have imports from the other side of the world for products you cannot produce yourself and could not be reasonably expected to produce yourself, either for climatic reasons or for whatever other reason was appropriate. But as a general principle, it is environmentally very, very sad and disturbing if we have a huge amount of economic activity transporting from the Pacific to London or from South Africa to Norway, products that actually can be produced equally well, either in the receiving country or very nearby. If we're trying to reduce carbon footprints, if we're trying to reduce unnecessary environmental consequences, then supply chains are necessary, but they should normally be on a much shorter length of distance than is currently the case. And that is not just a China point, but obviously China, as one of the world's largest economies, is spending a huge amount of effort transporting vast amounts of products to the other side of the world, where they may be cheaper, they may be good quality, and that is obviously the prime reason why they've been successful, but that should nevertheless lead to at least a much more serious attempt, not just in London or Washington, but pretty well throughout the world, to re-examine how sensible supply chains are, not just because of reliability of access when you need these products, but also for the new environmental priorities that are increasingly going to dominate global debates and decisions over the next 5, 10, 20, 30 years.
I mean, on that point of supply chains, it brings me over to sort of the World Trade Organization. I mean, can the WTO manage China's approach to trade, and can it fit within the WTO? And what's the future of China's relationship in that organization? So I'll just sort of nod there from Sir Malcolm. So we just go there first.
Well, just very, very briefly, WTO has very little enforcement powers. I mean, it's a necessary organization. I'm strongly in favor of the WTO because it's been a leading proponent of free trade, of global free trade, and that's something which has added to the prosperity of the world as a whole. It's done more to increase prosperity and remove poverty than almost any other single factor. And so that's good. But the WTO also tries to regulate trade, and that depends on global consent. And part of the problem with China is it hasn't got the rule of law. There is no system whereby you can use its courts, its legal procedures, in order to get an objective judgment as to what is right and what is wrong. China's whole legal system is controlled by the state and is simply an arm of the state. And for a country as massive as China, that has global implications. If it was only a small country like Myanmar or Uganda or Ireland, then it doesn't matter so much because it doesn't have a global impact in the same way. In China's case, it matters one heck of a lot.
And Bonnie Glaser, thoughts on that?
Well, first I have to say you've given me an opportunity to plug my website, which is chinapower.csis.org. And we have a lot of features that try to unpack Chinese power in different areas. We do have a page on China and the WTO, which looks at all of the cases since China joined that it has been involved in. Both cases China has launched and cases that have been filed against China and those outcomes. And it has an analytical discussion of where China has complied and where it has not. And I think that the takeaway is that when the WTO was created, it was not created with the emergence, in mind of this huge economy that is essentially state-run and operates in a mercantilist fashion. So if you have small countries that engage in WTO violations, it's not terribly significant. So you have this very, very large economy like China that produces a lot of subsidies for its companies and engages in forced technology transfer and other things. And it has created enormous challenges for the WTO. So number one is that the WTO needs to be upgraded and updated. And I think that the EU has already done some thinking about that. The US has some catching up to do because during the Trump administration, the United States just stopped allowing judges to be appointed to the dispute settlement mechanism, which further undermined the ability of the WTO to function. That has now stopped. And I hope that we can update the WTO to include things like digital trade, which didn't exist when the WTO was created, and try to create more mechanisms that can make it a more credible institution. It will never be perfect. China's system, which is rule by law, not rule of law, will never be a very good match for that kind of a global organization. But nevertheless, I think we need the WTO and we should try to make it as effective as we possibly can.
I suppose that sort of leads on in the WTO is looking at in a sort of more contemporary example about looking at Australia and what you mentioned, Bonnie, in your opening part about the fact that there has been difficulties in trade between the two of them. I mean, we know sort of $800 million Australian dollars worth of coal is sitting outside China waiting to go in. And that is, as it's been claimed, because of Canberra's banning of Huawei and investigations into the origin of COVID. I mean, where should the Australians go next, and how should the WTO respond to this? But Bonnie, if we just go to you first.
Yeah, I actually have an article on my website with some lengthy policy recommendations, some of which I mentioned today. First of all, of course, there has to be diversification. And, Australia has had a very large percentage of its exports going to China. And when much of the world has experienced some economic downturn or even recession, Australia has been insulated from that because of its taking advantage of the market in China, and particularly iron ore and LNG. And that has worked very well for Australia. But its overdependence on China has made it vulnerable. And so what we have seen over the course of the last 6 months to a year is some of these sectors that have been subject to this trade coercion from China have very successfully diversified to other export markets. They have learned lessons. And I think in the future, very few sectors in Australia are going to remain as dependent on China as they have been in the past. I think that they did the right thing in filing a case, which is on barley. And we'll see. I mean, look, WTO cases under normal circumstances take at least a year to have a ruling, and that would be quick. But in this current environment in which there has been an insufficient number of judges, we're seeing a delay in cases to 2 and even 3 years. So Australia really can't wait. But at the same time, I hope that other countries will join this WTO case and will try to come up with ways, as I said, to impose costs on China. Because in the absence of costs, China's going to continue imposing these measures.
Mm. And so, Malcolm, what's your thoughts on this? What can Australia practically do, and how should the WTO respond?
Well, Australia took a strategic decision 20 years ago that looking to the future, its relationship, economic relationship, trade relationship with China would be the single most important decision it could take. And of course, it reflected the relative geographical proximity of Australia to China compared to Australia to many other potential markets elsewhere in the world. And I don't criticize them for that original decision. That was at a time when, although we didn't expect China to become a Western-style democracy, the world as a whole, including Britain and the United States and Australia, assumed that however slowly, China, having adopted a capitalist system, would become a more open society, a more liberal society, and would very slowly reform in a positive direction. Now, of course, as we've seen, not only has that not happened, but the exact opposite has happened. Under Xi Jinping, China hasn't not just become more like the West, it's gone back to Mao Zedong's totalitarian system, not his economic policies. Communism itself, as I mentioned earlier, that's been binned and will not be resurrected in any meaningful way. But actually, China, because of technology, is more totalitarian today than Mao Zedong could ever achieve. So Australia, for all sorts of reasons, Australia is a democratic society. Its values are not the same as that of China, Chinese government, and so forth. And although economic trade does not directly depend on shared political values, it's inevitably influenced by it. And because Australia's main exports are to China, are its sort of natural resources, fortunately, there are markets elsewhere in the world that will be able to purchase many of these products, but it will take time. So I'm no great economist, but I suspect Australia will go through a difficult few years as it reorientates its market. But I can just give one tiny example,
of course,
where it can work, and that was New Zealand. When Britain first joined the common market, the European community, up till then, 99% of New Zealand's exports of lamb and dairy products and so forth went to the United Kingdom for reasons connected with the old British Empire. And although we were able to win sort of transitional agreements for New Zealand, they realized in future they would have to sell elsewhere. And you know, they not only did that, they did it so successfully that today New Zealand agriculture is about the only country in the world where the farmers neither receive nor want to receive subsidies from the taxpayer. Now, obviously New Zealand's a lot smaller than Australia, but it is the same part of the world, and it shows what can be done.
No, very interesting point on there. I mean, I suppose we sort of bring the discussion and have a thought about bringing it up with New Zealand there, about Britain's place in all of this. You mentioned in your own opening speech about we should be fairly wary of our trade with them particularly in a national security sense. I mean, if we look at what's happened over the last couple of weeks, you've got Ofcom, the British regulators, revoked CGTN's license. The Foreign Secretary in the United Kingdom has now called the Uyghur detention camps akin to torture, and British business should stay away. And China is now no longer accepting B&O, British National Overseas Passports, as identification. I mean, is China, the policies that Britain's adopted, is China likely to respond with economic retaliation, just as it has with Australia, as we've just touched on, one of the Five Eyes intelligence?
Well,
Sir Malcolm.
It is possible, though I suspect less likely. The British market is quite a big market, which China would not want to lose. But you touched on Hong Kong, and of course, what's happened in Hong Kong over the last 12 months is hugely more important to the United Kingdom than any other country in the world other than the people of Hong Kong themselves, because it's all based on the two systems in one country commitment that the Chinese government gave, and to be fair, honored for the first 10 to 20 years after Hong Kong returned to China in 1997, until about 3 or 4 years ago, although the Chinese predecessors of Xi Jinping tried to whittle down the freedoms of Hong Kong, it didn't push it very hard. Now that's now totally been transformed. And of course, the most serious mistake, in my view, that Xi Jinping is making is he will kill the goose that has laid the golden egg. You cannot preserve Hong Kong's substantial economic and trading importance, not just to the wider world, but to China itself, if you destroy the rule of law in Hong Kong. That's what makes Hong Kong a magnet for investment for people who also want to trade in China, but through Hong Kong. Because if there are legal disputes, if there are legal issues, they go to what has up till now been a completely free legal system, courts of law, judges who are not under government control. Perhaps I might be allowed to give you an actual conversation I had when I was Foreign Secretary with the then Chinese Foreign Minister, highly relevant to what is happening at the moment. I went to China several times in the final stage of the Hong Kong negotiations. And I'm referring to about 1995, 1996. And on my way to Beijing to see the Chinese Foreign Minister, I went through Hong Kong so I could have discussions with the people in Hong Kong. And they said, when you go to Beijing, will you please say to the Chinese Foreign Minister that what we're most worried about when we become part of China again is not just the question of whether we can vote for more than one candidate at elections, important though that is. It's whether we will still enjoy the rule of law. Now, I suspect everyone listening to this evening's event knows what we mean by the rule of law. Judges, legal system that is not simply dictated by whoever is the politicians in power at that particular moment. So when I got to Beijing and I saw the foreign minister, I put this point to him. I said, the people of Hong Kong are concerned whether they will still enjoy the rule of law when they become part of China again. I've never forgotten his answer. He was speaking in Chinese, but through the interpreter, he said, oh, don't worry, Mr. Rifkind. We in China, we too believe in the rule of law. In China, the people must obey the law. And I said, now hold on a moment. When we talk about the rule of law, it's not just the people who must obey the law. It's the government must be under the law. If people have a dispute because of something the government's doing, and the judges rule that the government's not observing the law, the government needs to back down. He not only didn't agree with me, he hadn't the faintest idea what I was talking about. Bonnie was right when she said a few moments ago, she said in China, they don't have the rule of law, they have rule by law. You use the legal system to criminalize your opponents if they, in peaceful ways, try to show their opposition to what you're doing. So I'm afraid that's going to be a pretty serious matter because it's not just a cultural dispute, it is a complete fundamental problem, not just between China and Britain, between China and its Asian neighbors as well, in Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, India, all of which have systems of law which do respect the rights of individual citizens.
Just before I bring in Bonnie on that, just quick response. I suppose that China might respond in the sense that while Hong Kong, when it was originally handed over, presented quite a big economic importance to China, its economic importance has since dwindled given the rise of Shanghai, Beijing, and indeed the cities surrounding it, which of course have been under China and have experienced relative and indeed very successful economic success. I mean,
You're right, except when you use the word dwindled. It's certainly reduced. At the time in 1997, there were no Chinese cities with significant financial, international financial ability to make an impact. And that is, as you rightly said, Shenzhen and Shanghai and one or two other places, that has changed. But it's not changed as fundamentally as sometimes people imagine. If you look, for example, at all the investment of people who wish to trade in China, if they're going to invest, they invest and they raise the capital through Hong Kong. Now, what will happen if Hong Kong's freedom is destroyed, as it is being destroyed, is that the young people of Hong Kong, who are the intellectual, brilliant, able people, they're the next generation of Hong Kong. They're not going to stay there. They're not going to become the subjects of a communist dictatorship. They're already beginning to examine where their futures lie. And already some of the great multinational companies, the banks, the lawyers, the insurance companies and so forth are saying, we don't have to be based in Hong Kong if it's now going to be controlled by Beijing. We can move to Singapore, we can move to Tokyo, we can move to Taiwan and still handle our Asian business in that way. So that does make serious, and I'm not saying that will persuade Beijing or Xi Jinping to change his mind. Sadly, it probably won't. And Hong Kong will become a pretty nondescript city, a bit like Macau or many other Chinese cities, and not the unique jewel it has been for the last 60, 70 years.
Referring to 3 million Hong Kongers who've been offered to come to Britain, I mean, there are the odd corporation in Hong Kong like HSBC that has actually supported the security law. But Bonnie, I mean, what's your thoughts on this? Where does Hong Kong sit in this web of trade?
Well, I think the important role of Hong Kong for China is not economic, it's financial. The renminbi is not an internationally convertible currency. And the Chinese have to have an easy way to quickly change the Chinese renminbi into convertible currencies and to use it internationally. And Hong Kong banks basically perform that function. So some people have said maybe Singapore could be used for that function. I'm not convinced that is a plan that China has. But I don't think that China can do this yet on the mainland because it wants to maintain very strict control over capital movements. And if they were to remove movements, the restrictions on capital, I think that could have unpredictable consequences for China. They're really not willing to let go of that control. So I think Hong Kong remains very important for Beijing, and that the Chinese are trying to sell the business community in Hong Kong on this idea that stability has been reimposed. There won't be any more protests in the street. This is good for business, so everybody should just get on board. And the fact that there are limited freedoms, may be good for business. They just announced, I think yesterday, the beginning of a trial, the first under the national security law, where there will be no jury. So there's just going to be 3 judges. So this is early evidence that rule of law is being undermined in Hong Kong. So I think it's very, very worrisome, but it is predictable because I don't think that China would have gone ahead last July in creating this new national security legislation unless they were 100% all in on undermining Hong Kong's autonomy, giving up essentially the one country, two system, because it really will exist in all but name. And exert control in whatever way they see is necessary in Hong Kong. And so some people said at the time, oh, we'll have to wait and see. Maybe China's just passing the law and maybe they won't actually implement it. And I think that was all very naive.
Could I just add one point to what Bonnie has said?
Of course.
Something that hasn't been mentioned yet. When Deng Xiaoping, the former Chinese leader, conceived of the idea of 2 systems in one country, it wasn't just to find a way of resolving the issue of Hong Kong.
It was for Taiwan.
It was Taiwan, exactly right. What he hoped and believed, and what successive Chinese presidents until Xi Jinping have believed, is that one day they would be able to say to the people of Taiwan, look at Hong Kong. You can return to the motherland without giving up your economic system, without giving up your freedom, without giving up your way of life. Now, what Xi Jinping has done is trashed that completely. Nobody in their right mind in Taiwan would argue that Hong Kong is now a model to follow and a reason for agreeing to reunify with the mainland. Now, that needn't have happened. And that is a fundamental strategic mistake from a Chinese point of view that Xi Jinping made when he destroyed Hong Kong's freedom. It made him look tough at the time he made that announcement, but he destroyed any prospect of a peaceful resolution of the issue with Taiwan. And so now Beijing is having to suggest that it will, if necessary, use military means. Well, that also is not as easy as it sounds when you have an island nation of 20 million people. And it's not that they could defeat China, but China would pay a huge military price before it was able to submit Taiwan to its control. And I doubt very much whether the people of China would be impressed if they were forced into that situation.
I mean, Bonnie, I know you've written a lot on Taiwan. Where does this put the Biden administration with Taiwan? If now we've brought it up, I mean, so Washington's cut ties with Taiwan to support the One China policy in 1979, but we've had the first Taiwanese representative to attend Biden's presidential inauguration. We've had recently U.S. warships in the Taiwan Strait with China fighter jets threatening the integrity of that. I mean, where does the Biden administration sit here with Taiwan?
This could be a whole nother session.
I mean, fairly briefly, because I want to move on to the states and looking at trade with states.
I'd like to lower the temperature on this whole topic. I don't think China's poised to invade Taiwan. And I think that every Chinese leader has put force on the table. The anti-secession law was passed in China in 2005, which didn't rule out the use of force. China has far more capabilities than it ever did in the military realm and in the economic realm. This is what we call gray zone actions. They're actions that stay below the threshold that would provoke a military response. And China has a very large toolkit of them that it is using against Taiwan to psychologically intimidate and harass the people, and to try and convince them that they have no alternative other than to unify with China. But I think that the likelihood of use of military force to invade Taiwan, to seize and occupy it, is quite unlikely in the near term. The Biden administration has inherited a policy from the Trump administration of doing much more publicly for Taiwan. But it's only a matter of degree. The United States has always had some high-level contacts with Taiwan. We've sold arms to Taiwan since 1979, when we broke diplomatic ties. We've always sailed our warships through the Taiwan Strait. We just haven't always announced it publicly. We conduct a lot of military exercises with Taiwan, but we keep it under the radar. So, what the Trump administration did was sort of much more and much more publicly. And I think the Biden administration will try to strike some kind of balance, continue to do more to reassure Taiwan that we care about its future, to demonstrate support for Taiwan as a democracy and support its values, and encourage the UK and other countries to do the same, by the way. And try to get Taiwan to participate more in the international community, like in the World Health Organization. But I think that the Biden administration will do so in a way that will be seen somewhat less provocative by Beijing. The Chinese have been worried that there's no floor, that one day they'd wake up and our Secretary of State or even the president would be in Taipei. That, I think, is going to go away. But most importantly is we are working on strengthening military deterrence. We have to make sure that Xi Jinping does not think that he has the capability to use military force against Taiwan to achieve any reasonable political goals. This is where we're falling short. That China's military capabilities are such that they can now impose huge costs on intervening US military assets, Air Force and naval assets. And this has sparked a debate in the United States about whether we should change our policy of strategic ambiguity to one of clarity. In other words, saying under all circumstances, we will come to Taiwan's defense. We are not obligated in our Taiwan Relations Act to come to Taiwan's defense. And some people are saying we should be. So there's a lot of questions. What do we need to do to make sure that there's no crisis in the Taiwan Strait? And I think that's what the Biden administration is going to have to confront down the road.
I mean, sort of touching on that, we've seen sort of subtle language changes coming out of the Biden administration, calling Taiwan's democratic elected representative versus Trump's language of directly referring to Tsai Ing-wen as president. I mean, so Malcolm, do you want to come in on that? Otherwise, I'm hoping to move on to Biden.
No, I don't think I very much agree with Bonnie's analysis, and I think that military invasion of Taiwan, I'm sure, is very unlikely. But the rhetoric itself, the more you use the rhetoric, and the more that the Chinese communists send their aircraft and their ships into Taiwanese waters, the more likelihood there would be that some incident, a naval incident or an incident involving bringing down an aircraft, could make the situation hugely more tense than it would otherwise be. So some wars begin by accident, and that is, I think, the most serious problem.
I mean, sort of coming on now, moving on to kind of dissecting, I suppose, a little bit more the Biden administration and looking at that relationship with trade and China. I mean, we've touched on supply chains, and particularly in relationship to defense. The Biden administration, after being in office for less than 24 hours, has already signed 15 executive orders, which far outweigh Obama's 8 and Trump's 9. But Biden's executive order was to review the US supply chains to ensure it's not too reliant on other nations, but particularly China, for tech and materials. So where does this put China's trade relationship with Biden and the US together? Bonnie, if we just go first.
I think we have yet to see what the Biden administration's trade policy is really going to be. It's early days. So you can see from the executive order, yes, there's concern about securing our supply chains in areas of high tech. We know that under Xi Jinping, there has been a stated ambition to dominate some of the most important key technologies of the 21st century. These were laid out in the Made in China 2025 plan. It's just one of China's many industrial policies. And so there's concern about protecting the US technological advantage and doing so with our allies, working together with other Western countries. But I still think that doesn't tell us much about the overall trade policy of the Biden administration. There are many people, both Republicans and Democrats are in Washington, D.C., who would like to see the United States rejoin the Trans-Pacific Partnership, now called the CPTPP. But I think Biden has made clear he's not going to be joining any multilateral trade agreement early. He has said that our foreign policy, and particularly our trade policy, should be benefiting American workers. So I think we're going to see a very different trade policy than we saw under the Obama administration. But it's early days. There could be some bilateral deals that we negotiate, but I just think trade is really going to be approached by Biden from the perspective of what's going to benefit the U.S. workers and the U.S. middle class.
And so Malcolm, if you want to come in on that there.
No, I don't even make one specific point that I think what's already emerging, and it probably would have happened even if Trump had continued as president, is that the United States, along with other countries, particularly in the West, are going to have to ensure the development of other sources of what are called rare earths. What's called rare earths, these are minerals which are crucial to some of the most modern technological devices that we all carry around with us and expect to be able to use. And China actually at the moment is, I think, responsible for about 80% of the production of these minerals, and therefore, in theory, could deprive the rest of the world, in the West in particular, of access to this extraordinary technology. Now, although they are cold rare earths, as far as I'm aware, they actually are not that rare. They exist in many parts of the world, but it has never been thought economically sufficiently attractive to put in the investment in order to extract them in parts of Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere. So that, I think, is going to be a priority, not just for the United States, but the United States, I think, will take the lead in trying to ensure that over the next 5–10 years, that situation changes so that China does not have the potential to actually seriously damage the access of these commodities, which are very important to our technological strength.
I mean, we sort of touching on trade deals and that economic relationship. You know, the US and China in January 2020 with Trump signed a trade deal, which a commitment for China to purchase $200 billion worth of goods and services over the next 2 years. And that has not materialized in the success that the states might have hoped. Indeed, China's only purchased less than 3/5 of what was agreed. So, I mean, how is a trading relationship between them going to work? Who's holding the bargaining chips here? Does China need America more than they need them, or is it the other way around? I mean, Bonnie, what's your thoughts on this?
Oh, I always think of this relationship as interdependent in so many ways. I don't think you can say that one country needs the other more. I mean, China's a more trade-dependent country than the United States is in general. We rely more on consumption than on exports. But China has many other markets, even though the US is, of course, extremely important, but it does have other markets. But the United States would suffer if China exported products to many other countries and not to the US. It provides American consumers with cheap things to buy. So I think that there is a mutual dependence there. But even before the onset of the pandemic, many people believe that China would never be able to purchase the promised products that it said it would. The numbers were so high, what it promised to purchase in LNG and in soybeans, across the board. Many people believe that if China actually got to about 80%, that was going to be huge. But let's remember that what was driving this was President Trump's belief that bilateral trade deficits are, for some reason, important, and that we should cut our trade deficit with China. And I think most economists do not agree with that assessment. Your overall trade deficit or surplus as a country is important, not necessarily with a particular country, especially one like China, which is the final processing point of so many products that are really produced in other countries and then move to China and are finally exported from China. But the Biden administration has several options in front of it. It can continue to adhere to this agreement, which has one more year before it expires. It expires at the end of 2021. It could essentially just decide to ignore the agreement. This isn't a treaty, so we could just forget it exists and start negotiating something new without even officially withdrawing from it. So we could decide to just negotiate a new agreement. The Biden administration, I think, has already signaled that it would like to get back to negotiating with China on the issues that the Trump administration was negotiating on at the beginning and then abandoned. And these are things like what I talked about earlier: subsidies to Chinese companies, forced technology transfer, stealing of intellectual property, and market access for American companies. So I think that we're likely to start negotiations with China at some point. I don't know what we're going to do about this particular phase one deal, but I think it wasn't a good deal to begin with.
And so, Malcolm, if you want to come in on that.
Nope, nothing to add.
Okay. On the point about negotiation and returning back to that negotiating position, is that even possible? I mean, you've got Mike Pompeo, the former US Secretary of State before he left, calling the Muslim detention of Uyghurs, I beg your pardon, the Chinese detention of Muslim Uyghurs a genocide. You've got the new Antony Blinken, the new US Secretary of State, has also called that genocide. And Yang Jiechi, who's the Chinese top diplomat, has asked the US to stop interfering in Hong Kong, Tibet, and Xinjiang. Is returning back to normalized negotiations on these things possible when they're so, and the US has made it so intertwined with diplomatic and human rights issues?
Well, it's not unique for the two to coexist. We had that problem with the Soviet Union during the bulk of the Cold War. There was a major conflict over human rights issues, over the right of Russians who wanted to leave the Soviet Union to be permitted to do so. Various individual cases of very high prominence, Andrei Sakharov and other dissidents. So trade is not sensibly dismantled or prevented because you have political disagreements. I think it would be very foolish to do that. So I think it's going to be a much more sophisticated policy. You have to, at risk of repeating myself, just two very simple conditions are required. If you provide access for another country to export their goods to you, there should be reciprocity, in not just in rhetoric, not just in words, but in deeds. That is hugely important. And secondly, free trade and encouragement of trade cannot apply in the same way where you're dealing with products or penetration that could damage your national security or the other vital requirements of your country. That's not just an American or a British issue. That applies pretty well to every country in the world, including China itself. So free trade is overwhelmingly a desirable objective, but there will always be constraints to that, and rightly so.
Bonnie Glaser, if you want to come in on there, or we're okay to move on. Yeah, well, I want to sort of touch on, before we end today, on the One Belt, One Road project. This is China's ambitious project to spend over $1 trillion on building infrastructure projects around emerging economies and developing countries around the world. How does this project fit into China's trade aspirations? What are we looking at here, and has the pandemic edited that? And what's the future of that, Bonnie?
So my first point that I'd like to make on the Belt and Road is that it's very complicated. Its motives are complex. The way it is being carried out is not a one-size-fits-all. So if you look at BRI projects in Greece, the port of Piraeus is one example that has been relatively successful. You can look at other projects and see that there has been some debt created in countries. That doesn't mean that China is seeking to impose debt on countries. Hasn't done its due diligence, probably shouldn't lend a country that was already in high debt more loans, but I don't think that China engages in debt trap diplomacy. And there's an article by a friend of mine, Deborah Browdigam, in this current issue of The Atlantic, looking at the case of Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, which many people said was an example of debt trap diplomacy, and she argues is not. In the connection here with trade is that, as I said, China wants to use trade to get countries to be more dependent on China, to convince countries not to challenge Chinese interests, to support China at the United Nations, for example, and to prevent countries from taking positions alongside the United States that might be harmful to China. And so the Belt and Road has been one way of doing that. In 2013, when this was first announced, nobody in China knew what Xi Jinping was talking about. They spent a year or more studying and trying to come up with a strategy for what Xi Jinping had first called the One Belt, One Road. And it still is called that, by the way, in Chinese. It's not called the Belt and Road Initiative, but it's basically one belt with China at the center and one road, with all roads leading to China. And there were commercial and economic drivers initially. There were companies that had excessive capacity that they could not actually utilize in China, and steel and cement, that they wanted to use abroad. State-run companies had built so much infrastructure in China, they had to employ their people. So good idea, let's tell them to go abroad. And it was 10 years before the Belt and Road policy that Xi Jinping initiated what was called the Zhou Chu policy, the going out policy, to encourage companies to invest abroad, to do business abroad. So this BRI to me was like an extension of this going out policy. China has stumbled in many ways. After the first 5 years, Xi Jinping admitted that there were some problems. They're now emphasizing more on green projects, so alternative energy, although they're still building coal-fired plants at the same time. And with the pandemic, I think they've been forced to make some priorities about where they're maybe losing money, where they're going to cut their losses. They're going to have to give countries an opportunity to pay back their debt over a period of many years. But China does want to be repaid. Let's remember, this is not analogous to the Marshall Plan. This is not a grant to countries to help them develop or to overcome their developmental challenges. It is, in fact, a loan, and Chinese banks expect to be repaid. So I would just say there's economic, there's political, there's strategic drivers, and some have been more important over time than others, but this is written into now the Constitution. So this is Xi Jinping's flagship foreign policy project. So we can just all call it a success because it'll have to be one.
Unless Malcolm, you want to come in on there.
I do want to say something on this, if I may. I must add to what Bonnie has said, that you cannot exaggerate the political and geopolitical consequences of China's Belt and Road Initiative. And I'm talking specifically in the time available about one of the most important things which hasn't been mentioned yet. And that is the opening up of vast amounts of trade between China through Central Asia to Western Europe.
Yeah.
And I don't think people in Europe have begun to understand the significance of this. And Russia is not yet fully absorbing the significance of it. Because in order to expand this trade, you have, and it's already happening, each day, each week, massive freight trains going west and east from China all the way to Europe. And they go through Kazakhstan, all the various stans that used to be part of the Soviet Union, and which until very recently, Russia was the dominant external country in relation to these states. China has already totally eclipsed Russia economically in Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, in this whole vast Central Asian territory. And that has major political implications for Russia's future security. But what is also happening for the first time in 2000 years, perhaps you could say the first time ever, Europe and China are going to be able to have trade and have contact with each other, not by going by maritime routes through the Suez Canal, around the Cape and the Indian Ocean and up through Singapore to China. Already a significant, and one day it will be a huge amount of trade, will be direct from China to Europe through Central Asia and the other way. It's a huge opportunity for Europe as well. But this is something which transforms our world. If you think of the way that Britain reached Hong Kong originally, it didn't go through Central Asia. It wasn't Marco Polo. It was basically going either around the Cape or through the Suez Canal. And as the empire went to India and then to Malaya and so forth to Singapore, eventually, for economic reasons, Hong Kong became British territory. So we're now living in a very different world. And whatever China's motives may be, Europe is as much involved in Belt and Road, and it transforms that whole geographical phenomenon up till forever. There's this huge empty landmass between Europe and China. The landmass is still there, but it's not empty anymore.
Thank you so much. And I think on that point, we are going to end our roundtable for today. So I just want to extend my thanks to Sir Malcolm and to Bonnie Glaser. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been terribly interesting. And thank you to everyone at home who's tuned in. To keep up to date, do follow us on Twitter with our handle China Future Soc. Sign up to our events on USA and do keep in contact. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining.